It's a very constant and a very important relationship for us.
Ms. Telford, do you have anything to add to that in terms of the lines of communication and in providing advice to the Prime Minister?
I would just add that, and I'm sure you heard this from the clerk, who I have primarily the most contact with is with the clerk and the National Security and Intelligence Advisor, and to only a slightly lesser degree, the deputy clerk. And they're also the ones who have the most contact with the Prime Minister. And so the clerk meets with the Prime Minister on a very regular basis, often meets with the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister together, and I will attend the majority of those meetings as well. And then she and I will talk regularly in between those meetings as well in terms of planning out, what needs to get covered and what's going on and prioritizing who else we might need in those meetings. And so, as John said, it's a very regular flow of information back and forth, and that's true for the entire Prime Minister's office. Everybody has counterparts of one kind or another on the public service side, and the flow of information is significant, though we do have clearly different roles in terms of what our responsibilities are to the Prime Minister, and of course, as I said earlier, how we're employed.
Thank you. Okay. That introduction out of the way, we'll turn to the matters before the Commission. And starting with the very early days of the convoy, can you describe to us when PMO first became aware that the convoy was a thing that was possibly rolling into Ottawa, what your initial impressions of it were, what your sources of information were, and the sort of pre-arrival early days?
So the week of January 17th, there were a few interactions. On Monday, January 17th, there was a report sent from PCO to PMO, I think one or two people in the Prime Minister's office. It might have actually come from a minister's office as a flag, that there was some slow roll activity in Emerson, Manitoba. At that point, though, that information was not shared beyond that. It was just one of any number of issues. As the week went on, though, we started to hear more and see more reports of the convoy protest. On Thursday, January 20th, there was an email that came from PCO to a number of people in PMO that laid out, it was an update on the convoy protest. I think it was focused on, it named 3 places specifically: Coutts, North Portal, Saskatchewan, and Ottawa. And the update also included a press release from the Canadian Trucking Alliance, which condemned the convoy activity, specifically proposed unlawful activity, which even at that point, what was coming out of a number of the speakers was proposed unlawful activity and road blockages specifically. So it was that week, January 17th, when we started to hear about this. That weekend, I'd say 22nd, 23rd, by then it was on everybody's radar. The week of the 24th is when the Prime Minister started to get updated daily on it.
Okay, and that takes us, Mr. Clerk, can you please bring up ssm.can.nsc402578. So, Mr. Clow, if I take this correctly, you were speaking at that point of PMO's sort of monitoring of what was going on. And I believe the 25th was the first time you got a briefing from the PCO.
So in addition to, I'll look at this email. So there was email traffic and there would have been phone calls the week of the 17th between PCO and PMO. But Tuesday the 25th, I do believe, was the first meeting scheduled with PCO and PMO staff to go through all of the elements as were known at that point.
Okay, so we're just going to look at what the content of that meeting was. Mr. Clerk, if you can scroll down, keep scrolling. Okay, there we go. So this is Mike McDonald, and we know, can you actually just refresh our memories as to who Mike McDonald is?
So he works in PCO and he's part of the national security team.
That's right, Intelligence Secretariat. Okay, so Mike McDonald is explaining and briefing essentially on what the state of knowledge there is at the time. So he says, latest lay of the land, security, coordination, national security apparatus, what do we know? Law enforcement across the country is learning more about the convoy and its organizers as they interact with them. And then there's some description of where it's coming from. The next bullet down says actively monitoring. One thing they're picking up on is chatter on social media. So far, RCMP telling us that the convoy itself is peaceful, not causing problems along the way. Their goal is to get to Ottawa, not have infractions along the way. And then very small online chatter, that's where people are using disturbing language. Mr. Clerk, if you can just keep scrolling to the next page, please. There we go. Following January 6th events last year, which is a reference to January 6th in Capitol Hill in the United States, NSIA worked with PPS, RCMP, and Sergeant-at-Arms for scenario planning for regular protests, push boundaries, and plan out for things like an insurrection. This has been done. Then Ottawa Police and PPS have an MOU, have done exercises for these types of protests. On the federal side, we have governance in place that is up and running. ADM, National Security Operations Center, meeting every day to ensure parts of the federal family are coordinated in efforts and can feed information through. So does that represent essentially, first of all, the content of that briefing as you were aware of it that day?
So I wasn't a part of this specific brief, but received this email. And so I have no reason to believe it doesn't represent what was discussed there. But I would say it's only a piece of the picture of what we were watching at that time. There's a reference in there to social media chatter and disturbing comments. And by this point, it was a very significant issue and getting a lot of coverage in media, some of those comments. This email was sent on January 25th, which is the same day it was reported in media that some individuals who were planning to participate in the demonstration were saying they wanted this to be their January 6th. That's why you see, I suspect you see this in this email summary because there were individuals explicitly referencing January 6th. And at this point as well, it was known in public that some people planning to participate in the demonstration had a proposal to replace the government by going to the Governor General and the Senate. And it's otherwise known as the MOU.
Okay, so just scrolling down a bit again, Mr. Clerk, there's a comment at the end there. So you'll see at the end it says questions, question mark, Zed, and I believe that's a reference to Zita Astravis, Bill Blair's Chief of Staff.
Yes.
Mr. Blair, Chief of Staff. So she says, curious to know how feed into political level. From our perspective, feel assured, having worked in the space of all work being done, but ministers feeling uneasy and keen on details. I'm wondering if you can help us understand what is meant there by sense of unease at the political level.
I think there at that point, there was a lot of conversation going on about what we were seeing and what we thought this was going to be. And there were a number of updates coming through, like the one you see here, but we were also seeing a lot in open source and through the media, which was very concerning. Already mentioned the reference to January 6th. So that's what I think this speaks to.
Okay, so is it fair to say then that in Mike McDonald's email that we just read through, the message coming through is essentially, well, we've planned for this. We did some planning after January 6th and things are sort of under control and the machine is operating as it should. But then Ms. Astravis raises a concern saying the ministers are actually pretty worried about this. So is it fair to say that there was some unease at the ministerial or the political level that maybe isn't reflected in the briefing?
Yes.
Okay. So then just moving, thank you, Mr. Clerk, you can take that document down. So that's the sort of pre-arrival state. Unless there's anything else you'd like to add about what was going on pre-arrival, but then chronologically, the next thing that happens is that the convoy arrives and doesn't leave when everyone expected it to do. And then we head into the first week of the protests, if we can call it that. So I'd like you to pull up now, Mr. Clerk, ssm.nsc.can402941.
Those are our names. And Marcel.
And as that's being done, maybe I can ask you to just describe to us from your point of view what that first week was like and what was going on from your perspective in attempting to respond. And the notes I'm pulling up here are Mr. Clow's notes from a February 3rd meeting, which I think can fairly be described as a brainstorming ideas kind of meeting. But before we get into the specifics of the notes, can you fill in a bit of the narrative of what was happening in your thinking and in your office at the time?
For the 2 nights? Okay, well, I'll use my Visa or cash.
So we watched the convoy arrive, not only in Ottawa, but there was activity in Coutts, very serious activity that first weekend. Emerson, we're starting to see some blockages there. It was down to 1 lane, would open up again. Some trucks would move, but there was activity in Emerson. So this was already a national issue in the first week. And we continued to see very concerning statements from some demonstrators, including from demonstrators and organizers, that they were not going to leave until the government changed its policy. But in that first weekend, law enforcement was responsible, local law enforcement, I should say. And by the end of the weekend, it was clear they weren't leaving. So I would say concern had increased at the end of the weekend. So we in the Prime Minister's office, with PCO, with ministers' offices, with caucus, with others, we were hearing a lot of concern, and we were discussing internally and getting updates and sharing information with each other as best we could. Before this meeting on the 3rd, which was well into the second week, there had been a briefing of the Prime Minister by the National Security Advisor and the clerk. So there were discussions happening. What happened on February 3rd and what these notes reflect is this was a Thursday, the second weekend was approaching, and law enforcement had not been able to contain the various protests. And in fact, in my view, they were getting worse. So we assembled and basically covered the waterfront. What's going on? Who's talking to who? What can we be doing more of? What are different provinces and municipalities asking? Are different provinces and municipalities asking questions that if they aren't asking for support, if they aren't, can we have a conversation with them to see if they should be asking for support?
Thank you for filling that in. Here we go, February 3rd. There's just a few points that I want to pick out here. So the first notation says JB, that's John Broadhead, Mr. Broadhead?
That was Jeremy Broadhurst.
Oh, that's Jeremy Broadhurst. Okay, this may get confusing.
Sorry.
Jeremy Broadhurst. Looks like OPS won't move. Weeks, not days. Weird reinforcements problem or something reinforcements problem.
Weekend reinforcements problem.
That makes more sense. Behind scenes, too deferential, need bad cop. You've got to use tools you have. Whether to change public message is different. And then KT, that's Ms. Telford?
Yes.
I can't read the first part. The second part says, what, if anything, can we do? What are options? So that's introducing this as a sort of a brainstorming of ideas. And then we'll see a variety of ideas expressed here. Mr. Clerk, can you just scroll down? We see, just above there, any way we can get Bergen's help. That's a reference to Candace Bergen.
I believe she had just become leader that day.
Okay. And then we have Ms. Astrova saying Blair doesn't want to call slowly, but he's open to calling Watson. And then RFA is a reference to a request for assistance, and we're going to come back to these in a moment. But Ontario could only ask if they've exhausted resources. Scrolling down again, please, Mr. Clerk, until you get to the bottom of the page. So here we have an intervention. Many of the ideas that are expressed here we've already heard about, so I'm skipping through them quickly. But at the bottom of the page here, this is a Yasser, I believe.
So that was separate from the meeting we just covered. That was a phone call from Ottawa Centre MP Yasser Nakvi. He called me and I wrote down what he told me.
Okay, that same day on February 3rd?
Same day.
Okay, so, and what he told you was clearly Ottawa Police and City are unable to deal with this. Reinforcements coming this weekend. It's going to really embolden these folks, my constituents, near breaking point. Worried people will take things into their own hands, I'm sorry. So does that reflect, Mr. Clow, what Mr. Nakvi was expressing to you?
Absolutely. And this was on February 3rd. So by this point, the Ottawa convoy had been here for a full week, a full 7 days, and Ottawa residents had experienced a lot. And I think you see that reflected in Mr. Nakvi's comments.
Okay, Mr. Clerk, can we just scroll down to the top of the next page?
I know.
Yeah, there we go. So I think this is a continuation of the phone call with Mr. Nakvi. What I heard from Slowly, plea for help. It's a plea for something political. Do you recall that reference, Mr. Clough?
I believe that was a reference to either the day before or earlier that week, Chief Slowly said there was no policing solution.
That's correct. It was the day before. And what I'm wondering is what was the reaction within PMO to that statement? Here we have Mr. Nakvi's, I think, interpretation of it, which is it's a plea for something. And then he says it's a plea for something political. Does that reflect, or was there any thinking among the three of you or among your office, within your office, about what Chief Slowly may have been expressing there?
It definitely added to the concern of what we were seeing. And to hear Ottawa Police say that this was not a policing solution was very concerning. And it told us that this was not going to end anytime soon.
I think we can leave those notes for now. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. The next ones we'll pull up. Well, it's actually the same notes. Sorry, Mr. Clerk. Keep scrolling down until you see February 6th. Yeah, there we go. So says PM February 6th, 6 to 8 p.m. So I assume this is a meeting that was with the Prime Minister, attended by, as it says here, the clerk, the NSIA, and then John, Janice, Jody, Sam. That would be John Broadhead, Mr. Broadhead. Janice is the clerk. Janice Charette, Jody Thomas, the NSIA. Sam, who's Sam?
Sam Cleel is the Director of Issues Management.
Okay.
And there were probably a few other people on that call, not many more. I'm confident Katie was on that call.
Okay, so if we just scroll down then until we see OPS trying to reduce violence or taking some steps. And then below that, Coots persists, but traffic is moving. AB, this is Alberta, asked for RFA. We don't see CAF, the Canadian Armed Forces, being able to help with that. Do you remember who was making that statement there? Is this the NSIA's update there, Mr. Clough?
So one, to situate this conversation, this was Sunday, February 6th in the evening, so the end of the second weekend. Prime Minister was updated just as he was updated the previous Sunday, because a second weekend had passed and Ottawa had worsened and other situations were becoming more difficult as well. And I note the NSA reported that 11 BC communities have protests, 35 across the country. So I can't tell from the notes if that comment was Jody Thomas's comment, the one you asked about, but it looks like it was part of a list of updates from Jody Thomas.
Were these briefings happening daily?
There were multiple conversations happening daily at this point, and there were interactions with the Prime Minister every day at this point in some way or another, but this specific construct of a meeting with the clerk, National Security Intelligence Advisor, and staff didn't happen every day, but it happened with increasing frequency.
Okay. So the next point that I want to look at here is right at the bottom of the page here. ON, that's a reference to Ontario, pushed back. And then the notation is PM. Establish list of mandates. I can't read the next word. Something vaccines.
Gyms, vaccines, all provincial.
Okay, and then under that it says DM for Solgen, so that would be Deputy Solicitor General, pushed back. And that takes us to an issue that we've canvassed a bit here in the Commission so far, and I'd like to get your perspective on this afternoon, which is what was going on in those early days of the protest, the first week and a half, in terms of interaction between various levels of government and the federal and provincial aspects, and especially Ontario's response or perhaps lack of response, if we can characterize it that way. Mr. Broadhead, I believe this is probably best put to you within your purview.
Sure, I can start and then folks can add in. So I would say there was lots of conversations happening at this point with various governments at the officials level, at the political level, across the country, as we tried to make sure we were hearing from them on what was happening on the ground, and making sure we had that intelligence. I think with respect to Ontario specifically, I think there was at the outset a different approach to this the strategy. And I think as we get to, we were quite keen on this idea of a tripartite table that Minister Blair had been working on. And we thought that was a good way of getting everybody at the table, making sure resources were aligned, making sure everyone looked each other in the eyes and worked together. And at that time, Ontario was not as keen on that approach. I don't really want to, speculate for what the Solicitor General or Deputy Minister Solicitor General at this point wasn't. But from my conversations with them, they did want to have Ottawa, the City of Ottawa, and the Ottawa Police Service kind of play the lead role. And we're not as interested at that time in the collaborative tripartite approach that we were interested in.
Okay. Mr. Clerk, can you take those notes down for a second and pull up ssm.nsc.can 403015, please? So, Mr. Broadhead, I think this is a text that goes to the point you were just elucidating. So we don't have a confirmed date for this one, but it must be some.
It's February 8th.
Thank you. And this is a text between you and Ms. Astravas, a text exchange. And she says to you, I believe she's in the blue here, Marco, that's a reference to Minister Mendicino, hasn't heard back from Sylvia Jones. That's a reference to the Solicitor General of Ontario on the meeting with the three orders of government, reference to the tripartite. And you say, yeah, because they don't want to be a part of it. And she says, oh, I know. And you say, so anything I should do, we should just go ahead without them. And then it goes on. So can you contextualize that for us a little bit?
Yeah, as they were getting kind of pushed back and or just not support from their counterparts, the Solicitor General in particular, they had asked me to connect with my contact in the Premier's office and to just check and see if was this something that the Ontario government or this minister, just to kind of ascertain some of those kind of contextual details. So I did. I chatted with Jamie Wallace, and it was clear that they were they had a different approach and strategy, and the tripartite table was not a priority for them at that time.
Sorry, who is Jamie Wallace for the record?
Sorry, Jamie Wallace is the Chief of Staff to Premier Ford.
Okay, so you had a conversation with Mr.
Yep.
Wallace, Chief of Staff to Premier Ford, and the message coming back to you was? This was not a strategy they wanted to pursue at this time. Was there any reason given for that?
It was, I think, my recollection of that conversation was it was really they wanted Ottawa to be the main driver of this and did not want a kind of multi-governmental approach to this at that time. That was the impression I got from that phone call.
Okay. Were you having interactions during this time with counterparts in other provinces as well?
Yeah, so previous to being a director of policy, which I started in January, I was senior advisor with a focus on intergovernmental affairs. And so through that, I got to work closely with a number of the provinces. The three I was having most contact with, one was British Columbia because they were chair of the Council of Federation at the time. So that was an ongoing active discussion generally. And I want to be clear, not just about this. For example, Mr. Wallace and I were working on childcare very actively at this time as well, and other issues were very would come up. So, and then other provinces as well. But the other part of our PMO, which is important in this, is the regional desks, who don't report to me. They're part of the operations team, but they have geographical areas of responsibility. So they're often in touch with provinces and cities, and we have kind of information sharing between us. So I'm in touch with them a lot. They let me know when things are happening. I do as well. So I know that in those times there was a lot of informal contact, as well as obviously from ministers and officials.
Okay, and we may come back to some of those interactions, but we'll stick to Ontario for now. Mr. Clerk, can you pull up ssm.nsc.can 402935? So, Ms. Telford, this is a text exchange between you and Minister Dominique Leblanc, whom we know is the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. And he writes to you and says, just got this from Vandergrift. So that's a reference to his Deputy Minister, Michael Vandergrift. Minister, want to let you know that the Ontario Solicitor General has again declined the invitation to attend the tripartite meeting today on the Ottawa occupation. And you say, I think we need to shine a light on that. He says, we'll say it. Can you explain to us what was going on in this text message and what you meant by, I think we need to shine a light on that?
So I think this was a continuation of what John was just talking about. This was obviously a further attempt at a meeting with the three levels of government, and Ontario was continuing to decline. I don't recall when he says, we'll say it, where that meant, but it putting myself back in that time, I think when I'm saying we should shine a light on it, it's bringing some attention to the fact that Ontario wasn't at the table. And we really did believe it would be a more efficient and effective way to work.
Would it be fair to say that there was some frustration with Ontario's response at this point?
There was definitely some frustration because we believed it could be easier than it was, all things being very relative at that time. But there was ongoing communication with Ontario bilaterally throughout. It just meant that the conversations were happening between Ottawa and the federal government and Ontario. And so there were just numerous bilateral conversations that we just thought could have been better handled and more efficient if we could have all just come together. Because as I know has come up throughout the inquiry, there was a fair bit of confusion around numbers and requests and the RFAs, the way they work, the request for assistance. They do need to go through the provincial.
So I'm going to ask you here about a meeting that was held on February 6th that was a sort of tripartite, but not quite, between the City of Ottawa, federal government and the provincial government. And the exchange I'm going to take you to, we've seen this document several times in the commission, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing. But at the end of the document, there's an exchange between the National Security Advisor and the Deputy Solicitor General of Ontario that I'd like to get your take on. So it's February 6th, an 11 o'clock meeting attended by officials from the three levels of government. So Mr. Clerk, if you can scroll down to the very bottom of the document. You'll see it says there, Jody Thomas, National Security Advisor, noted that it was a positive meeting and regrets to end on this following point. Would the province be looking to the federal government if this protest was happening outside the City of Ottawa, e.g. happening in other places like Kingston? And the response from Mr. Di Tommaso was, this is a protest and encampment moving against the federal mandate on trucks. They came to Ottawa from across the country for that purpose. Now, Mr. Di Tommaso testified at the commission approximately 2 weeks ago, and he expressed that in his view, he interpreted Ms. Thomas's comment as, and I'll quote the words here, the federal government wanting to wash its hands of the entire matter. And so I'd just like to get your reaction in terms of whether you think that was a fair assessment of what was going on, whether you think that was what was being expressed there, and what Ms. Thomas was trying to express when she said, would the province be looking to the federal government if this was somewhere other than Ottawa?
I might start, I'm not putting too much weight into this. As I read it, and I wasn't there, but this strikes me as frustration and a bit of a back and forth in that frustration happening, and both sides kind of articulating some of that frustration. I think we were trying to look for ways to work together. There were three levels of government, and it was a challenge to get these machines working in the right direction. And I think this back and forth my guess would be this is an outcrop of just a frustration around those levels of government and the two different approaches that I've outlined before.
Fair enough. And you can appreciate that one of the issues that the commission is looking into is the interaction between governments, and which is not always an easy thing, but how it all played out here. Okay, so eventually, around the time of February 7th, 8th, 9th, Ontario became more engaged when the Ambassador Bridge blockade became entrenched. And so we know that that has happened. And I'll take you at that point to the witness summary. I'm sorry, Mr. Clerk. It's WTS 6014, page 11. Oh, I'm sorry. 83. I'm sorry, I got the wrong number. 83. 14 is the IR. So if we scroll down to page 11, please, Mr. Clerk. Keep scrolling. Oh, keep scrolling. Okay, scroll up a bit, please. What I'm looking for is the panel was asked what, in their view, could be that I have the wrong page number. While they're looking for the reference, Mr. Broadhead, what I want to ask you about is what, in your view, you were asked this during the interview, and I'd like you to elaborate on it. What inspired the shift from Ontario? Why did it happen then, and how did that occur?
And I'll preface my answer by saying this is me not in the government of Ontario, which I did spend a long time in the government of Ontario, but I was not there at this point. I think it, in a sense, it started to become absolutely clear that we had to work together. So it was almost the increase of things happening. So you add the Ambassador Bridge to the Ottawa situation. You have other things starting to happen around the province, in New Windsor, Sarnia, Cornwall, and all. I think it became clear, and I'm hypothesizing here that, but we did see an evolution of their strategy at that time. In terms of at the political level collaboration, I think there's lots going on in other places that I don't want to comment to, but just that's what I can specifically comment to.
Okay. And we know that there were several important phone calls that happened around that time, certainly between the Prime Minister and Premier Ford, which I will talk about tomorrow when the Prime Minister is here, between Minister LeBlanc. We talked about when Minister LeBlanc was here. Leaving Ontario for a moment and talking about engagement with other provinces, I do want to ask you some questions about another topic that's come up several times here, which is Alberta's request for assistance. So I'm going to put to you a few facts that we know and that have come out already at the Commission and that are also brought out in the PMO institutional report. So there's a notation in your IR that PMO staff engaged with Pam Livingston. So Mr. Broadhead, maybe you can tell us who Pam Livingston is?
Pam Livingston at the time was Chief of Staff to Premier Kenney.
Okay, and there were two interactions apparently between PMO and Ms. Livingston about the Alberta request for assistance. Okay, and that request for assistance we've seen several times before, so no need to pull it up, but was for essentially assistance in tow trucks and removing vehicles from the Coutts blockade. There's also a notation that the Prime Minister had a formal call on February 6th with Minister Blair to discuss Alberta's request for assistance and the ongoing situation. And then I'm going to pull up, or ask the clerk to pull up Mr. Clow's notes again, ssm.nsc.can 402941. So this is the notation I said we'd come back to. This is the meeting that you're having with the Prime Minister on February 6th, and the notation. There it is. Thank you. Coots persists, but traffic is moving. Alberta asked for RFA. We don't see CAF being able to help with that. So at that point, it's apparently been concluded or decided in some form that the Canadian Armed Forces is unable to assist. Is that correct, Mr. Clough?
So the RFA came in the day before that, and it immediately spurred a number of conversations with different offices. Ministers were consulted, and the Prime Minister was consulted on a few different occasions about this. And yes, there was a general sense that CAF should be a last resort, but also in this specific case, I think you've heard from other witnesses as well, but at the time, the discussion was that this was not an appropriate or even useful response to what the problem was. And what I mean by that was were these trucks actually going to be able to do the job? That was all part of the discussion that ensued after the request came in on the 5th.
What I'm really wondering about all of these exchanges, and there was a further meeting apparently on the 9th where, again, this time it was Ms. Telford, Ms. Charette, the Prime Minister, and Ministers LeBlanc, Mendocino, and Blair all discussing the RFA during one of the meetings that was held. Why was this RFA treated quite differently than most are? This was elevated to the level of the PMO and the Prime Minister, which most requests for assistance are not. Can you explain or elaborate on that?
And you might want to add to this, but we are usually made aware of requests for assistance wherever they're going in government. And in this case, we were obviously following everything to do with the blockades and the occupation very, very closely. And in this case, because the feedback from departments was coming that there wasn't a way to help, and what we were trying to do was support anybody who needed assistance on the ground. And so if Alberta was asking for help, we wanted to be able to support them. So it just led to a lot of conversations. It kind of comes to the role that our office often plays of coordination and facilitation, because we then started reaching out and asking questions of other departments saying, does anyone else have the equipment that they might be looking for? It may not be appropriate for CAF and they may not have the equipment, but is there that equipment somewhere else that could be found? So I think, as is in the interview summary, we even went so far as to say, does Parks Canada have this kind of thing? Because the goal was to be able to assist if we could.
And maybe if I can just add, I think that, we also looked at, can we reimburse if they find them privately? Should we reimburse that? So I kind of push back a little bit on that. This rarely happens. Like in a case where the process comes through and it goes to the minister, and I know of other cases where it was like, no, we can't assist. The minister's office will often flag it to us, and we'll ask questions about, well, have we explored this? And I can remember other instances where that was the case, where we just pushed more to find other solutions that in the kind of narrow band of the RFA process they may not have thought of.
Okay, that's fair. It's the request for assistance that we're dealing with in the commission. It's the only one that we've seen this pattern in, but that's fair explanation. Okay, I'm going to want to shift gears now and talk about what you were hearing during this process with various stakeholders and interlocutors, both nationally and internationally. So, Mr. Clough, I'll start with you. We know you had a few conversations with a man named Juan Gonzalez, who's the special advisor to President Biden. Can you tell us about those conversations and what you were hearing from him?
Yes. So I heard from Juan Gonzalez. He is part of the national security team in the White House, and we'd interacted on a few files before the convoy protests. And he reached out, I believe, on Wednesday, February 9th. At that point, it was a request to connect National Security Intelligence Advisor Jody Thomas with the White House Homeland Security Advisor to urgently discuss the Windsor blockade, but also other border blockades that were in effect at that time. So Juan and I had a bit of back and forth about that. That then led to a number of conversations, some of which you heard about this morning from the Deputy Prime Minister. But there were various interactions between the Prime Minister's office, PCO, several ministers' offices, and their counterparts in the United States, in the White House, and different departments in the United States, because they became seized with the border blockades that were impacting them quite significantly.
So you mentioned that we heard this morning from the Deputy Prime Minister that she was hearing a lot of concern from officials in the United States about what was going on, and some encouragement, if we can put it that way, to bring a swift end, given the impact this was going to have on Canada-US relations and trade. Were you hearing similar concerns from the people you were talking to in the United States and or in other countries?
Absolutely. And the concern was not only about trade, economics, dollars and cents. It was for sure. But there was also a discussion in many of these conversations, including between the Prime Minister and the President, that both countries were facing similar forces in certain ways. For example, the United States also saw some convoy activity. I think it was dealt with quite quickly by the Americans, but they saw a trucker protest heading to the Super Bowl. There was one that was trying to be assembled to head to Washington, D.C. So these were part of the conversations as well. It was viewed as a shared problem. But for sure, the immediate issue was the blockades at various border crossings, especially Windsor, and how do we sort these out quickly.
And we understand you also had some conversations with Ambassador Hillman, ambassador to the United States. Can you tell us about those conversations?
Well, she was one of the key principals having interactions with the White House and various departments in the United States. And the substance, one example of substance within those conversations was how can we introduce measures to end the blockades or at least dissuade them from growing and from new ones from popping up. For example, there was discussion of potential immigration measures or penalties placed on people who conducted unlawful activity at these border blockades. There was definitely discussion of whether the United States could provide tow trucks to help, given it was virtually impossible to get tow trucks on the Canadian side of the border. So that's the kind of thing that was discussed.
And did that ever end up happening?
I don't know. So the immigration measures, I don't believe the United States implemented any measures. We did in the Emergencies Act. In terms of tow trucks being provided by the United States, there might have been some in Detroit, Windsor, provided by Detroit or the government of Michigan. I'm not sure about that.
Mr. Broadhead, Ms. Telford, were either of you having conversations with international counterparts? No?
Not during the occupation or when the blockades were on. For months afterwards, I can say, including up until recent summits, though, this is a topic that continues to come up with counterparts from various countries. And the Prime Minister also had calls during the occupation with other world leaders where this was a topic that was coming up, because they were watching what was happening in Canada and concerned that they were starting to see the same thing in some of their countries, and they were concerned about copycat situations. So this has been an ongoing conversation with international leaders.
Okay.
I would just add as well, another feature of all of the conversations between the Americans and us, including the call between the Prime Minister and the President, was the fact that a lot of the support for the unlawful activity here in Canada was coming from the United States in terms of money, in terms of people, and in terms of political support from some of the most
Oh my God, my phone are blowing for a walk. My phone overheated. Under the pillow.
individuals and politicians aren't allowed to comment on politics and policies in other countries. It happens all the time. But the concern for us was it was direct encouragement for unlawful activity that was hugely damaging to the country, including the border blockades. So that's why I raise it here, and that's why the President and the Prime Minister spoke about it. It was the support for unlawful activity.
Okay. Mr. Clerk, can
Your phone's too hot. Sorry, guys. AC. I'm gonna get ready for a motorcycle ride. We'll get this bag going here.
scroll down?
Okay, we're back.
Keep scrolling. Keep scrolling. Keep going. I think it's just after this. Keep going, please.
Yeah.
Can you zoom out a little bit, please, Mr. Clerk, so we can see? Thanks. Okay. Keep going up a little bit. And
So a little bit further up. A little bit further. So I think you see.
yeah, there we go. Okay. So first question, we don't have a date on this because it's sort of, there's some blackout before that, but do you remember the date of this, Mr. Claw?
I believe it was February 9th.
Okay. So it's a meeting on February 9th, and
This is various things happening over the course of the day.
Why don't you
I wouldn't
tell
call
us
this
what-
one meeting.
why don't you tell us what was happening?
So February 9th there were a few conversations going on. I don't specifically remember what meetings at what times, but I did write down, and it was reported to us that Minister Blair had spoken to the clerk about the Emergencies Act. And that was in the lead up, I think, just one day before.
I'm gonna let it cool off. The phone is overheating.
Bring this to a close in some way. So as you say, Blair spoke to the clerk and talked about the Emergencies Act on the options. Can you just read your handwriting there? Didn't commit on the options. Emergency could be peace if that sounds like we have authority. And then a reference to Nathalie Drouin, the deputy clerk, and Fort
So
Justice.
I see this as discussions are happening about how we can help, what more we can be doing. And the Emergencies Act could be a piece of that.
Okay. And we know that the following day, the Prime Minister convened the first incident response group meeting.
Yes.
So I'd like you to tell us a bit about that meeting, the decision to convene the IRG and what that meant in the Prime Minister's eyes, in your eyes, and what an IRG really is.
I think as the clerk may have
The decision to convene the IRG and what that meant in the Prime Minister's eyes, in your eyes, and what an IRG really is.
I think as the clerk may have and the occupation, of course, is now really entrenched in Ottawa. And so as we were having these meetings, the clerk, I believe, advised the Prime Minister, though it made good sense to the group of us at the time as well, that it was time to formalize our structure moving forward, and that we were at a point of national crisis, and that's what the incident response group is put together for. It was a group that was, it was a cabinet committee that was created, I believe, in the first mandate of the government midway through, and it is chaired by the Prime Minister. It does not have a set permanent membership. It is convened with the ministers appropriate to whatever the incident is that is being discussed. And the thing that makes it very different from other cabinet committees is where in another cabinet committee that tends to be policy focused and a little longer term. This is obviously dealing with something in real time and some.
Or is it playing underneath it all? Or is it just ended already? Wait, how do I get back to it?
Our officials. And so whether it's the NSIA, whether it's the commissioner of the RCMP, whether it was the head of CSIS, depending on the incident in past, it might be the CAF and the chief of defense staff. And then the ministers are called on by the Prime Minister to add anything that they might see as not having been covered, to add any thoughts they have on the basis of the information that's been presented. But they are all sitting around the same table, which makes it quite a different meeting than really any other.
And what's the purpose of that? Why is an IRG structured like that with direct input from officials?
I think for a number of reasons, it's their expertise and getting it in real time to the Prime.
Okay. I don't know how to get back to my freaking home. How do I stop my own damn thing?